In the first part of this two-part series we have shown how differently Europe and the Muslim world reacted to the invention of the telescope beginning of the 17th century. In Europe, an almost feverish activity started to gain new knowledge about the universe. Momentous discoveries were made almost immediately after the invention of the device. This was in striking contrast to the Muslim world, where telescopes were also available within a few years after its invention, but there was no attempt made to use them for astronomical observations. This is made even more puzzling by the fact that the Muslim world had been at the forefront of astronomical research for hundreds of years during the Middle Ages. Why did scientific curiosity decrease in that part of the world so dramatically by the 17th century? And why didn't the same happen to Europe, too? Why did Europe, instead, experience a huge increase of scientific curiosity, leading to the scientific revolution? We shall try to answer these questions in what follows. Multiculturalist leftists don't like to acknowledge such differences between cultures. They particularly dislike if inconvenient evidence is presented for the superiority of European culture in any respect. Thus, this discussion has a political dimension, and we shall touch on this at the end of this video too. A number of books about the history of science and philosophy have been used as sources for this video. The book titles are below in the video description. After they conquered the Middle East from the Byzantine and Persian empires, the Arabs had access to sophisticated ancient Greek texts in philosophy, science and medicine. During the Abbasid Caliphate, in the second half of the 8th century, a translation movement started which lasted for about 200 years. Large numbers of classic Greek texts were eagerly translated. This effort was supported by the caliphs and by Muslim officials. This infusion of classical Greek knowledge kicked off sophisticated research, writing and debate in philosophy, science and medicine. Al-Kindi, Al-Farabi, and Avicenna were some of the famous philosophers, living between the 9th and 11th centuries. They were influenced by these Greek works, in particular by Aristotle's writings. Toby Huff writes this in his book The Rise of Early Modern Science. From the 8th century to the end of the 14th, Arabic science was the most advanced science in the world, significantly surpassing Europe and China. In virtually every field of endeavor, in astronomy, alchemy, mathematics, medicine, optics, and so forth, Arabic natural philosophers were in the forefront of scientific advance. However, many historians of science think that this so-called Golden Age of Islam started to decay after a few hundred years of progress. Stephen Weinberg writes in his book To Explain the World, "It is hard to avoid the impression that science in the Islamic world began to lose momentum toward the end of the Abbasid era, that is, mid-13th century, and then continued to decline. When the scientific revolution came, it took place only in Europe, not in the lands of Islam, and it was not joined by Islamic scientists. Even after telescopes became available in the 17th century, astronomical observatories in Islamic countries continued to be limited to naked eye astronomy, though aided by elaborate instruments, undertaken largely for calendrical and religious, rather than scientific purposes." Edward Grant, in his book Foundations of Modern Science in the Middle Ages, writes this: "By the close of the 15th century, Islamic science seems to have lost its momentum and entered a state of decline, just as science in the West began an upward surge that would produce major changes in the 16th and 17th century, culminate in a new physics, astronomy and cosmology." Toby Huff again, driven by both curiosity and religious motives, the Arab-Muslim world from the 8th to the 14th century achieved significant heights of scientific advance, but thereafter, and perhaps as early as the 12th century, went into decline and even retrogression. Why did this decline happen? And, an equally interesting question, why did such a decline not happen in Europe? Why, instead, did European science and philosophy progress towards the scientific revolution and beyond? In what follows we'll discuss differences between European Christian culture and Islamic culture, which we think were responsible for the different paths that these two civilizations took. Scientific curiosity means being curious about nature, about its phenomena, its laws, and about causal relationships between events in nature. Thus, a basic condition for scientific curiosity to exist is that the existence of natural laws and causal relationships in nature is acknowledged. It also helps if society has a positive attitude towards scholars who philosophize about such things and towards scientists. How did European Christianity and Islam compare in this respect? Both Islamic and European Christian societies were highly religious. Both of these religions state the existence of an Almighty God. However, there were large differences between Islam and Christianity about the way God's influence is manifest in the world. In Islam, there have been many different creeds and sects from early on, which fought each other fiercely about many issues, for example about what characteristics God has, whether the Quran was created by God or existed together with God eternally, and so on. However, there has been almost universal agreement between all creeds that God is absolutely almighty. One important creed was that of the so-called traditionalists, for whom the only source of religious truth was in the Holy Scripts and in the Islamic traditions. Philosophy, and even philosophizing about religion, that is theology, was rejected by them. This is what Ibn Hanbal, the probably most famous traditionalist in the 8th century, had to say about God's power. The predetermination of everything is from Allah, both of the good and the evil, of the little and the much, of what is outward and what is inward, of what is sweet and what is bitter, of what is liked and what is disliked, of what is fine and what is bad, of what is first and what is last. Adultery, theft, wine drinking, homicide, consuming unlawful wealth, idolatry, and all sins come about by Allah's decree and predetermination. Everyone does what he was created to do, and comes to what was decreed for him and known about him. Allah is the doer of what he decides on, and the accomplisher of what he wills. Ibn Hanbal's influence has been long-lasting and is alive today. In this book he is called one of the saviors of the Islamic spirit. A modern TV series, The Imam, is about his life. Ibn Hanbal was the founder of the Hanbali school of Islamic law, one of the currently existing 4 Sunni Islamic schools of jurisprudence. The sect of the Mu'tazilites, also active in the 8th century, were opponents of Ibn Hanbal. They were one of the few Islamic sects who thought that there were some limitations on God's power. For example, God could not be unjust. However, it was also the Mu'tazilites who came up with a radical atomistic theory about God's influence in the world. In their book, Defenders of Reason in Islam, the authors write this about the Mu'tazilites. The Mu'tazilites maintained that physical reality is composed of basic physical entities or atoms. God creates the world in each instant, by creating atoms and attributes. Creation is thus a continual divine activity. Thus, God recreates all atoms in the whole universe in each moment, in a slightly different constellation, giving an illusion of change. There is no causal relationship between the atoms at 2 different time points, and thus natural causes do not exist. God is the only cause for everything that happens in nature. There was only one exception to this universal causation by God. Humans were supposed to have free will and thus able to cause their own actions. Mu'tazilite ideas became adopted by the rulers in Baghdad. Their teachings became state doctrine in 833 under the Abbasid Caliph al-Ma'mun. People like Ibn Hanbal, who did not accept Mu'tazilite doctrines, were persecuted. However, state support for the Mu'tazilites' views was withdrawn after 15 years. Their influence waned and the traditionalists who were earlier persecuted became influential again. Mu'tazilite influence was further weakened in the 10th century by al-Ashari, a former Mu'tazilite. Al-Ashari held the same sort of atomistic views as the Mu'tazilites. That is, the world consists of atoms and God recreates these atoms in every moment. However, al-Ashari went further than the Mu'tazilites, by emphasizing God's influence on humans' actions, too. Al-Ashari's ideas triggered the birth of a movement, the Asharites. They differed from the traditionalists in that the Asharites were happy to apply Greek-style logical arguments to argue their case, while the traditionalists rejected any philosophizing. The most famous follower of al-Ashari was al-Ghazali, a Muslim theologian who lived about 100 years after al-Ashari, in the 11th century. In his famous book, The Incoherence of the Philosophers, he heavily criticized Muslim philosophers who were influenced by Greek philosophy. His main target was Avicenna, the 11th century Persian philosopher. The book The Incoherence of the Philosophers also contains the probably most famous summary of the Asharite view of the omnipotence of God. Al-Ghazali writes this: "The connection between what is habitually believed to be a cause and what is habitually believed to be an effect is not necessary, according to us. But, with any two things, it is not a necessity of the existence of the one that the other should exist. For example, the quenching of thirst and drinking, satiety and eating, burning and contact with fire, light and the appearance of the sun, death and decapitation, healing and the drinking of medicine, the purging of the bowels and the using of a purgative, and so on. Their connection is due to the prior decree of God, who creates them side by side." In this extraordinary statement, Al-Ghazali denies natural causation. According to him, there is no causal connection between events. Every single event in the world is created by God, separate from any other events. God is the only cause of events in the world. One basic assumption that anybody who practices science has to make is that events can have natural causes. If views like those of Al-Ghazali, and of many other Muslim theologians, become mainstream in a society, this can have disastrous effects on science in that society. Such views did become mainstream in Islamic societies over time, and they have remained mainstream until today. Al-Ghazali is still one of the most respected theologians in Islam. On the poster from 2012, shown here, advertising a seminar about him, he is called an Imam and Hujjat al-Islam, or Proof of Islam. As another example of the reverence Al-Ghazali receives in current-day Muslim society, the website Egypt Today writes the following about Al-Ghazali in 2017. One of the greatest renewers of the faith in history was the 11th century scholar Abu Hamid al-Ghazali. Today, he is known as Hujjat al-Islam, the Proof of Islam, because of his efforts in intellectually fighting against some of the most dangerous ideas and philosophies that plagued the Muslim world during his time. From the ubiquitous nature of ancient Greek philosophy to the rising tide of political Shiism, Imam al-Ghazali did not leave a stone unturned in his effort to bring back serious Islamic scholarship in the face of heterodox threats. One has to add that the views of Al-Ghazali and of the Asharites were not the only ones directed against natural science and philosophy. Traditionalist followers of Ibn Hanbal and Islamic mysticism, that is Sufism, were also becoming more influential. Majid Fakhri writes this in his book Islamic Philosophy. Although Al-Ghazali's assault on philosophy in the 11th century was devastating, he had retained the right of reason to arbitrate in theological controversies, and distinguished clearly between those parts of philosophy which clash with fundamental principles of religion and those that did not, like logic, ethics and mathematics. Despite Al-Ghazali's reservations, however, the gap between philosophy and theology continued to widen during the next 3 centuries and beyond. The new anti-rationalism took one of two forms. One was to return to the Hanbalite position, which rejected all philosophical, and even theological, methods of discourse, and clung to the sacred text, literally interpreted. And the second was acquiescence in mysticism or the Sufi path, which tried to circumvent those methods by recourse to the methods of direct communication with the divine. One of the most famous representatives of the Hanbalite movement was Ibn Taymiyyah, a scholar who lived in the 14th century. Majid Fakhri again. The source of all religious truth, according to Ibn Taymiyyah, is the Quran, supplemented by the Hadith and interpreted by the companions of the Prophet or their immediate successors. The authority of those early scholars, confirmed by the consensus, is infallible. None of the successors of those two generations can lay claim to infallibility, as the centuries of controversy and theology, philosophy and mysticism actually demonstrate. Furthermore, since the companions and the successors have solved all the problems that might interest the Muslim community, any opinions or practices that have emerged subsequently should be declared innovations or heresies. Ibn Taymiyyah was a controversial figure, and there is some debate about how much influence he had during his time, but his influence definitely grew over time. His teachings greatly influenced Wahhabism in the 18th century and modern-day Salafism and Jihadism. As an example of the reverence that some Muslims, even those living in the West, still pay to Ibn Taymiyyah, here is an article on a Swedish-language website about him, translated into English. Note the praise Ibn Taymiyyah receives for fighting against innovations which crept into Islam and against followers of Greek philosophy. Summing all this up, all the influential streams of thought in Islam became increasingly opposed to natural philosophy and to secular ideas about nature. Philosophy was either totally shunned, or it was merged more and more into theology. Philosophical thinking thus became more and more about questions of religion, and less about more worldly, secular topics. Thus, after an initial so-called golden age of advanced science and philosophy, the Islamic world was turning more and more towards religion and away from Greek-style secular natural philosophy. Historian of science Edward Grant regards philosophizing about nature, that is, natural philosophy, as the mother of all sciences. Thus, we can expect that if this withers away in a society, science will wither away as well, and with it, intellectual curiosity. This is what seems to have happened in Islamic society during the centuries after its golden age. Let's now turn to Europe and see how beliefs about natural reality were developing there. Just as in Islam, there was a translation movement in Europe too. This took place during the 12th and 13th centuries, a few hundred years later than in Islam. The same Greek scientific and philosophical literature was translated into Latin, partially from the Greek originals and also from the earlier Arabic translations. Also similarly as in Islam, this literature triggered new research, writing and debate in philosophy, science and medicine. Aristotle's natural philosophy was particularly important. The possibility of further progress in these areas was laid down. At the same time, just as Islam, European Christianity was a very religious society too. God was seen as almighty. It was assumed that he was able to interfere in nature. We have seen how such ideas were expressed in Islam by Al-Ghazali, al-Ashari, Ibn Hanbal and others. We have seen how all-encompassing God's interference in the world was in the view of these Muslim scholars. How did European Christians compare in this respect? How did they see this omnipotence of God? Albertus Magnus, a Dominican friar, was one of the most respected Christian scholars and theologians in Europe in the 13th century. He taught at the University of Paris. This is what science historian David Lindberg writes about his views with regard to God's role in nature. He acknowledged that God is ultimately the cause of everything, but he argued that God customarily works through natural causes and that the natural philosopher's obligation was to take the latter to their limit. Albert pointed out that God employs natural causes to accomplish his purposes, and the philosopher's task is not to investigate the causes of God's will, but to inquire into the natural causes by which God's will produces its effect. Thomas Aquinas, also a Dominican friar, studied under Albertus Magnus and later became a professor of theology at the University of Paris. He was influenced by Aristotle's philosophy and in his work tried to bring Aristotelian philosophy and Christian theology together. He posited God as the primary cause of everything but, similarly to Albertus Magnus, he also assumed secondary, natural causation in nature. Ideas like these by Albertus Magnus and Thomas Aquinas were not unusual in European Christianity. Already during the 12th century, 100 years before Albertus Magnus and Thomas Aquinas, William of Conches and others, like Thierry of Chartres, expressed similar views. James Hannam writes in his book, God's Philosophers. William of Conches suggested that when we consider the reasons behind an event, we have to look at both primary and secondary causes. According to William, the primary cause, the ultimate reason why anything happens, is God. However, nature obeys the laws that God ordained when he created the world. These natural laws are the secondary causes that God usually uses. Thus, many Christian theologians didn't see God as constantly meddling in the world and as the only cause for everything that happens, the way most of the influential Muslim thinkers saw him. Nature could have its own domain, with its own laws. Natural cause-effect relationships were possible. These then could be theorized about and investigated by philosophers and natural scientists. There was some backlash against these ideas. Bonaventure was a Franciscan monk who, like Thomas Aquinas, also taught theology at the University of Paris during the 13th century. David Lindberg writes this about him. Bonaventure was pessimistic about the capacity of reason alone, without the assistance of divine illumination, to discover truth, and as a result, he was apt to keep philosophy on a short leash. Bonaventure stressed God's participation in every cause and effect. There was also a more general backlash by the Church against teaching specific ideas of Aristotle and of his followers at the University of Paris. In 1277, Etienne Tempier, the Bishop of Paris, forbid teaching a large number of Aristotelian theses, for example that the universe has eternally existed. Even a few theses by Thomas Aquinas were forbidden. However, teaching Aristotle was not itself forbidden, and thus there was no complete rejection of the natural philosophy of Aristotle. Following the 5th century Church Father Augustine, philosophy was seen as a handmaid of theology. Thus, though in a subordinate role, it had its legitimate niche, and it became stronger over time in this niche. Less than 50 years after the condemnation of 1277, in 1323, Thomas Aquinas was proclaimed a saint by the Church, and 2 years later, in 1325, the condemnation of his theses were rescinded. Teaching of Aristotle at the University of Paris soon recovered to such an extent that new teachers at the arts faculty of the University of Paris in the 1340s were required to swear that they will teach Aristotle, except, of course, those doctrines which were contrary to Christian teachings. As everybody who wanted to study theology had to first study arts, the idea that nature has its own laws and that cause and effect works in nature without direct interventions by God became mainstream in the Church and in European Christianity in general. This was a large difference to what was happening in Islam at the same time. There, as mentioned before, Asharite teachings became more and more mainstream. Al-Ghazali was revered as the proof of Islam. Followers of the extremely traditionalist teachings of Ibn Hanbal and of Sufism were also gaining influence. Religion was becoming increasingly important at the cost of natural philosophy. In Islam, the bottom of the barrel, natural philosophy, was falling out, and science was falling out with it. In contrast, in European Christianity the bottom was becoming stronger, protecting a growing scientific movement. The question posed at the beginning was this: why there was such a difference between how Europe and the Christian world reacted to the invention of the telescope. Part of the answer, and in our view the main part, was given. Science, and scientific curiosity, in the Muslim world withered away because its basic philosophical foundations withered away. Muslims became disinterested to learn about the universe. For them, religion explained everything important about the world. In the view of their most influential thinkers, God has predetermined everything that happens and will happen in the world. Nature itself has no reliable laws. God controls nature directly, in every moment. God has his own reasons for doing so, which humans cannot understand, nor should they try to understand. As shown before, all this was different in European Christianity. Though there was tension between natural philosophy and the Christian Church, natural philosophy and secular philosophizing acquired a legitimate niche. The idea that nature has its own laws and that there are natural cause and effect relationships was accepted by important European thinkers. This was the foundational idea which kept scientific curiosity alive in European intellectual circles. The lack of this foundational idea in the Muslim world made scientific curiosity gradually disappear. This can explain, on the one hand, the surge of astronomical observations in Europe using the telescope as soon as the device was invented, and on the other hand the total lack of interest using the telescope for astronomical observations in the Muslim world. In addition to these differences in religiosity, there were many differences between Europe and the Muslim world in other areas, too. One important difference in the systems of higher education: universities in Europe, madrasas in the Muslim world. Another difference was that scientific communications in Europe were greatly enhanced by book printing, which started in Europe already in the 15th century. In contrast, in the most important Muslim empire, the Ottoman Empire, it didn't start until the 19th century, though there was some book printing for a few years during the 18th century. A further difference: that Greek philosophy among the religious elite in the Muslim world was always seen as a foreign science. In Europe it was seen, for historical reasons, as less foreign, and thus it was easier to integrate it into European thinking. We won't analyze these additional differences here, but we think that many of them, like those related to education, are strongly related to the differences in religiosity. Some questions remained unanswered. For example, given the later overwhelming religiosity of Muslim societies, how was it possible that during the Middle Ages it was the intellectually most developed region of the world for several centuries? And why didn't in Europe religion overwhelm science and philosophy, as it did in the Muslim world? These questions require a separate treatment, and we plan further videos to try to give answers to them. In any case, the conclusion that can be drawn from the story of the telescope in Europe and in the Muslim world is this: cultures are indeed not equal. Muslim culture was superior to European culture during part of the Middle Ages in a number of ways. This was true with regard to science and philosophy. However, Europe caught up between the 14th and 16th centuries, and by the 17th century it was superior to the Muslim world intellectually. During the 17th century this intellectual divide between the two cultures widened exponentially, and it has continued to widen ever since. According to our analysis here, these developments have to do with differences in religiosity in these two cultures. In addition to being fascinating historical developments, these processes have an important political dimension, too. They demonstrate that cultures are by no means equal, and thus they have relevance for one of the ruling ideologies of our time: multiculturalism. The multicultural left, because it doesn't want to see any important differences between cultures, is happy with, and is in fact keen on, mass migration from any culture into Europe. Furthermore, when people from different cultures arrive in Europe, they are encouraged to keep as much of their culture as possible, as it results in more so-called diversity in European society. The story of the telescope demonstrates how a previously intellectually active Muslim culture could lose its intellectual curiosity. We have seen how Islamic religiosity, as it has developed over many centuries since the so-called Golden Age of Islam, has probably been the main cause of this. Religious ideas are not easy to change, even if there was a pressure from European society towards Muslims living there to change them. But of course, given that there has been a shift in the European mindset towards leftism and multiculturalism, there is no such pressure. In fact, there are many voices among the European left demanding that it is Europeans who should adapt to Muslims living among them instead of the opposite. Thus, we can expect that Muslim religious ideas will not substantially change in the foreseeable future, and that an enlightened Euro-Islam will probably remain a fantasy. There is much evidence, and this video has shown some, that the ideas of people like Al-Ghazali and Ibn Taymiyyah, who were at the forefront of the fight against European-style philosophy during the Middle Ages, are popular in current-day Muslim societies. There is a danger for European culture in this. With the continuous increase of the size and proportion of the Muslim population in Europe, such radically anti-scientific and anti-philosophical ideas can gain ground. The result could then be a decline in Europe's intellectual productivity, repeating the same development that the Muslim world went through when it gradually lost scientific curiosity after its golden age.